After Effects when we get into it that you'll notice. But one of the similarities is not the startup screen. The startup screen is much more like Illustrator and your other Adobe apps for the most part. At least I think it is anyway. I've got mine set up, and I'm not sure when you launch yours if you have the exact same screen. I've got mine set up to show a launch screen whenever it starts. But within this launch screen, it's much the same as anything else. It's much like the interface for Illustrator and anything else. We got the opportunity to create a new project, open a project. There's a Learn tab, to help to do little tutorials and whatnot, which has got some nice tutorials, simple little things. But it'll also keep all your most recently opened items here. So some of the things that we're going to look at After Effects mostly type animations, simple logo animations. We're going to look at a little bit of basic character animation, that sort of thing. Keep it on kind of a high graphics kind of a level. But I'm going to start this by simply opening a new project. And whenever I do, it gives me an interface like this. And this is the default interface, which is, I usually start with the default or the starter interface, one of the two. But on this starter interface, we've got a project window over here like we have in Premiere, and this project window is where all of our assets for our project go. So any photos, video, any Illustrator graphics or Photoshop graphics will all be organized in this panel. And we can still organize this into folders just like we can in Premiere. Keep things organized, all of our assets separated out. I think that in After Effects, it's important, much more so than some of the other ones. I think it's really important to do that, because if you get a very big file, you get a lot of assets in this folder, and it becomes kind of confusing. And unless you're really good about naming stuff, finding the right elements quickly can become confusing. So that's, this project window is where all those assets will show up. So this middle window is our composition panel. So in Illustrator, we've got artboards, and Photoshop, we have canvases. In After Effects, we have composition windows. Basically, a composition is our artboard, if you will. It's our motion-based artboard. And there's a couple of different ways to create compositions. On a brand new project, we can simply click this button right here to create a new composition. Or in our project window, down here to the bottom, there's a little gray icon with a couple of colorful shapes in it, kind of tiny. We can click on that. Really, we only have access to this icon when we first open the program, and if we don't have a project loaded. So if the project is empty, we'll have this at our disposal. After Effects does really allow you to only keep a single project at a time open. So if I've got a project for Fall RV Fest, opening graphics, then everything in this workspace is going to be for opening graphics. If I need to switch to another job, Employee Navigator, instructional video, then I've got to make sure I save all of my parts in this, and I open up the new project. So I keep one project at a time open. Now, within this project, I can have a lot of different compositions. That's not a problem. But the workspace serves basically one project at a time. All of our different workspaces are available here along the top. Also under the window menu, just like all the other apps, workspace. And if you ever really mess up a workspace and you need to get it back to the way it originally was or its default setup, just come down here to the bottom and reset. And this will say whatever the layout you're working in is. In this case, it's reset default to the saved layout, and that'll bring everything back. I've got to go to that, I have to go to that menu item all the time because I'm always managing to close out my composition window. Bringing a new one up and getting it positioned is just a pain, so I just reset the workspace. But, so if you need to, keep that in mind, all right? We've got some other options over here along the side that these all change based upon what it is we're working with. It seems we have a whole new brush panel option in this new version, which I guess I'll have to check out. But we'll get into what shows up over here based upon what as we're working. I mean, but and then our last item is down here, just kind of like in Premiere, we've got our timeline. The difference between the timeline in After Effects and Premiere is that, if you recall, whenever we create a new Premiere project or a new sequence, that was like a 10-minute long timeline or something, or 5-minute long timeline or something like that. We worked in a little section, set in and out points for our export areas, and we could actually duplicate a composition, 30-second video clip. We could copy that and duplicate it further down our timeline and make edits to that and try different versions that way. That's really not the way it works in After Effects. We actually set our composition up to a time span that we want, and that's what this timeline will represent. So if I'm creating a little composition for a 15-second introduction, I'll set my composition for 15 seconds, and that's how long this timeline will be. And that's not to say that if I feel the need, I can't create a composition that's 5 minutes long and only work with a small portion of it. But I feel like that's a lot more cumbersome in After Effects than it really is in Premiere. So I usually try to make my compositions fairly close to the time that I want. If I'm working on a 30-second spot of some kind, I'll usually set that initial composition to maybe a minute so that I've got some room to work. But as I get close to the end, I'll usually crop it down to the 30 seconds. It's much easier to make, from that standpoint, I think it's much easier to make sure that your composition is the length of time that it needs to be. So that's what this will be. And all of our project assets are going to show up over here. And you'll see as we start working with it, this list can get really long. So there are a couple of different workflow strategies we'll look at when working with After Effects to be able to organize this and keep it somewhat manageable, working in parts and pre-composing elements together and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the quick spin around the After Effects interface. So if I'm going to create a new composition, I'll get a new composition window. And all I'm really going to worry about is there are some presets here. So you can pick, and it's got some standard social media sizes and that sort of thing, HDTV. I generally work in the top set, the HD set. Most of mine I set up 29.97 frames a second, and I'm going to work at 1920 by 1080 for now. So I'll just leave that in there. I can set custom width and height here, where the width and the height are. If I want to make sure, if I want to enlarge this, say I want to make this 4K. So 4K, if 1920 by 1080 is an HD composition, 4K is actually 2 times that. So I could always, if I decide I want to work in 4K, I can lock this aspect ratio. And like I said, it's a 4K composition is 2 times larger than a HD composition. So I can, rather than remembering the numbers off the top of my head, I can just do, I can just do 1920 times 2, and that'll create the new dimensions for me. So I can do, just like the other Adobe apps, I can put formulas into a size window that way, and it'll do it. So this now is a 4K composition. It's still that 1920 by 1080 format, that 16:9 format ratio, but it's a 4K composition. So I don't generally like to work in unless I have to work in 4K, I don't. So I'm going to actually set up a different one. But this brings me to kind of my next item. So you notice I created that composition, and over here in my project window is composition 1. And here's composition 1. That's the composition I'm working on. I'll have multiple compositions within a project. All of these compositions will show up over here in my project panel alongside of my other assets. So, but comp 1 isn't very descriptive. If I want to change the name of this, I can do a couple of things. I can either select it here on the sidebar, tap my return key, and I can rename it right there as it is. So, main 4K comp. I can do that. The other thing I can do is, rather than, if there's other things I need to change about it, I can select it, go up to composition, and go to composition settings, which is also Command K on my keyboard. I can also get to that by right-clicking on the composition, and composition settings is right at the top. So it's right-click on the composition settings are at the top, or composition, select it, go to the composition menu, composition settings are right here, or it's Command K on my keyboard, one of the two. But when I open my composition settings up, I've got all of my primary settings back here that I had before. And I can make other edits, which I want to because I hit the return key far too fast when I set that up and I didn't finish my setup. So anyway, here's my composition window again. There's my new name for this. I'll leave this as a 4K comp for now because I want to create another one. But I can change my frame rate right here if I want. It's got presets. Most video, will either be 30 frames a second to 24 frames a second, right in there. I can also come down and, so start time code, I've never found a reason for this to be anything other than 0. But duration is kind of where I want to change my time, the length of it. So, and I'm just going to enlarge this real quick so I can see it a little better. To point out that, so within our duration window, we've got 4 sets of numbers separated by colons. This first set on the left, on the right-hand side, the first double 0 are our tenths of a second. The second set are seconds, so you can see right now my composition is only 5 seconds long. The next set is minutes, and the last one is hours. So if I want to do, if I want to do a 60-second video, I've got my option of setting my seconds here to 60, changing 05 to 60, or I can make that 00, and I can make this set of numbers 01. That would get 60 seconds being a minute. That would give me a minute-long composition. I'm actually going to change this composition from 5 seconds. Actually, so that's what the time code numbers are. Tenths of a second, seconds, minutes, hours, reading across from right to left. So if I Go back up here. I'm going to change 5 seconds to actually, I'm going to change it to 10, just for sake of the little example I'm going to do here. I can also change my background color. By default, it's black. Background color is not, it depends on how you render it out, but if you render out a regular MP4, just leaving your background color as black will actually give you a black background. But even though it's black, or even though I can set a color for it, it's not really a true background, if that makes any sense. It's kind of the default. But it's also a transparent background, because if I were to render out to Apple ProRes, it'll actually treat that as a transparent space, and my ProRes file would have my graphics in it, but anything that's that black area would be transparent. So generally, if we export as an MP4 file, as it is right now, it would make the background black if I didn't have an image or video covering it. But generally what we're always going to want to do is place a color background of some kind in our composition. If we're just doing graphics or whatever. It kind of varies, but just understand that just because I can set this color to anything I want it to be in the composition window doesn't necessarily mean that that's always the color my background's going to render in. A lot of the time it will, but not always. So as we work through this, you'll see that I use solids a lot to create my backgrounds. And that's the sure way to know that I've got a color background of some kind that's going to render the right way no matter what format I need to render to. So will probably make a little more sense the further I go along, but regardless. So that's kind of what that's what the composition window looks like. We can set our sizes. I'm actually going to change this back from 4K to just regular HD for now. It does have a 4K size. It does have 4K sizings I could have selected, but I'm just going to go back to regular HD. Say OK, and there we go. So that's my first kind of quick spin around. So this is great, but I've got nothing really in it. So let's add some stuff to our composition here that we can actually do something fun with. Much like Premiere, we've got down here in our timeline window, we've got, this is where, like I said, where all of our assets will show up. So if I go up here to my layer panel, say new, and I add a solid to it, leave all that alone, set a bright blue solid, it's going to show up over here on this side. And if I go and I place some type on top of it, it's going to show up down here. All of the elements within my composition are going to show up here within this timeline menu. Just like in others, if it's on top, it holds precedence. If it's on the bottom, they're stacked in layers, basically. If my background is at the bottom of this list, so it's behind this type layer. If I move my type layer below that background, my type layer is still there, but it's being hidden by the solid. So we can move stuff around. So just remember that it's a hierarchical kind of in order. All right? So I've got a couple of elements, and you'll see that over here in my timeline, there's some stuff I can work with. But I'm going to take a look here at the very top of this first. So there's two gray bars. There's this one with little blue ends. That's our time magnification, kind of the I'm not 100% sure if that's the proper term for it, but that's the term I always use. I mean, we can enlarge stuff and reduce stuff, but if we want to zoom in on something on our timeline so we can see what we're working on better, this is the slider that we use. Again, like Premiere, it's the same item as Premiere. It's just a heck of a lot easier to see and manipulate, I think, than what they have in Premiere. So, but if I zoom in, all I'm really doing is zooming in on time. You see, if I look at the biggest difference you can see here right now is that right now this is reading off in seconds, 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, 4 second, etc. But if I pull this in, I'm suddenly, at this point, I'm looking at 15 frames. It says 100 frames. It's because that's actually 30 frames. 30 frames is a second. A second 15, 2 seconds, second 2:15, 3 seconds, etc. And if I scale this down even further, now I'm looking at frames, 5, 10, 15, 20, etc. Scale it down even more, and I'm looking at each individual frame. My first frame, my second frame, my third frame, etc. So we can kind of zoom in, because with motion graphics, a lot of times, motion graphics tend to move fast. And when you think of fast, initially I think, at least I know I always did, I thought, oh, so it's, it's going to go by in a second, or it's going to go by in 2 seconds. That's pretty fast. Well, no, it's really not. When you get into working with motion graphics and timing things, we're talking about tenths of a second, 10 frames or 20 frames out of our second, So we really want to be able to kind of zoom in on that sometimes, and that's the way we do it. The second gray bar here is our trim bar, composition trim. And so if I pull this back out, I can see the other end. But if I've got something set up, or I'm working on a longish composition, say I'm working on a 2-minute long explainer video or something like that. That's a fairly long, for the workspace we've got here, that's a lot of time to fit in this little area. A lot of times I'll want to work on one section or another independently. I'll want to finish up my first section or my third middle section or whatever. I can actually, and if I hit the space bar on my keyboard, you'll see that this little playhead here, this blue dot, if I hit the space bar, this is going to play across through my 10 seconds all the way to the end, and then it's going to start over again. But if I'm only working on the first couple of seconds of this and I want to preview how it looks, I don't want to wait on 10 seconds to play through, or I don't want to have to catch it all the time. So I'll grab the end of this trim bar and slide it into maybe 3 seconds, so that now when I hit that space bar, it plays through to 3 seconds and it jumps back to the beginning and starts there again. This is nice because a lot of times what you'll do is set up an animation, animate something, and you'll want to watch it a few times through to get a feel for the rhythm of it before you go making changes. And being able to shorten this up and look at just that clip over and over again is usually pretty helpful, or at least I find it to be helpful all the time. There always isn't anything I do that, because you never get your timing right the first time through. You've always got to make small adjustments and tweaks and whatnot. So that's what our trim bar does. Also, if I were to go ahead and render this right now and I leave this trim bar at this size, this is the only section that's going to render. Even though I might have wanted the entire 10 seconds, I've got to actually pull this back out to render the entire thing. So, but that's what this trim bar does. So again, as we get into working with this, you'll get a better feel for it. It's, one thing for me to explain it, it's another thing to use it and realize its value. So that's our timeline, and then quite honestly, the rest of this is stuff to go through as we need it, and we'll touch on almost all of it. Actually, we'll touch on all of it. But, we can turn on and off a layer with the eyeball. We can lock it. We can also solo it. So on this side here, this little dot, if I click on just the dot for my type layer, it hides everything else and only shows that type layer. So it's called soloing, so that I just see one thing at a time. I can actually solo multiple layers, but if I turn that solo dot off, I'll see everything again. It's kind of the inverse of hiding an individual layer. Where the eyeball will just hide the type layer, soloing will show only my type layer. And we can lock it. And we've got our little sound icon here. If the clip that we have, if we've got a video clip in here that has audio in it, we can mute that audio just by clicking on that speaker icon that'll be next to the layer. So that's what that is. We've got this label. We can change colors of our different layers or different types of elements to help us organize things. So if I want all of my solids to actually be, I can click on this layer and decide that I want all my solids to be a cyan color. So anytime I've got a solid, I can set it to cyan so I can pick it out real easy. By default, type is always red, and I just leave it that way. But again, you can change that as well if you want. It's layer color coding. And again, it's one of those things that, remember that it's there because as we build compositions, and you get 20 elements in this list, which is going to run down out of this frame, some form of organization is going to be something you want to have. And color coding is one way to do that. So the rest of all of this we'll go through later, but these are referred to as switches, different features. And there's this line down here at the bottom that says toggle switches and modes. So if these are switches, if I click on toggle switches and modes, it's going to change that to some different mode settings, which give us layer effects or layer styles, some matte options, which we'll look at later, and our parenting stays no matter whether I'm looking at switches and modes or not, but these are modes. Clicking this line of type down here toggles back and forth between modes and switches. So, and then the rest of it, like I said, we'll kind of look at as we go through the speed graphs and stuff like that. So, but that's our workspace. So there's all that stuff. Let's look at how we actually animate something and make it work. So if I select my type here and go down here to this menu, if I open up this arrow right next to it, you'll see that right now there are a couple of different subcategories underneath it. I've got text and I've got transform. These will vary based upon what you have. I've got a type layer here, so of course I've got text as an option. If I've got an Illustrator file, a graphic that I brought in, I won't have this text option, but I'll almost always have this transform option. And if I look at the transform option, I can adjust position of my anchor point, the position of the object, scale, rotation, and its opacity. So if I go here to scale, and right now there's a little link next to these, so my X and my Y height are linked together. If I just click on that and slide, I can scale objects up and down pretty easily. I can also go out here with my selection tool, click on a corner and scale that way as well. But all of my basic properties that I can transform will show up here under the transform menu. So I would say 50 to 60% of the animation that you do will probably be done from these settings right here. What's kind of nice about this is that if I close these all back up, if I close this all back up again, if I know that I just want to change the scale of something, and I just tap the S key on my keyboard, that will open only the scale option, only the scale transform. If I think I just want to modify my rotation, I tap the R key on my keyboard, that'll bring up only my rotation option. Position is P. Anchor is not A. Anchor is, I forget what anchor is. But opacity is not O. Opacity is T for transparency. So go figure. But that's what it is. And I can just sort of slide, change my transparency that way. So those are our general transform controls. We also have transform controls on our toolbar up here at the very top. So this is our direct selection. If we use our selection tool, we can, scale stuff up and down like I said before. There's also rotation. And this right here is our pan behind, or it's the anchor point tool. And with the anchor point tool, I can actually, if you notice on my type, my anchor point is actually down here on the corner of the baseline because it's flush left and the anchor point always sets on the baseline of type. I can click on that center point, slide it up to the middle of my type if I want to. Just like anything else, anytime I do a transform, a rotate, a position, a scale, it's always going to do that transform on my center point. So if I don't want to scale from the lower left-hand corner of my type line here, then I need to move that anchor point somewhere else to where I do want to manipulate it from. So if I move it to the middle, it now scales from the middle. And there are faster ways to set it to the middle, but that's, in a nutshell, how you do that. Rotate, center point. This little hand allows us to pan around, sort of, if I zoom in here, I can kind of pan around my workspace with the hand. I can do the same thing by holding down my space bar, and I can pan as well. Space bar will allow me to pan. Magnify, you can pretty much hold down the option key, it'll zoom out. You can zoom in, but you can also just do Command plus and Command minus on the keyboard to zoom in and out. If you're using a mouse with a wheel, the wheel will do the same thing. And then we've got other options. We've got a pen tool. Primitives, we can draw rectangles, circles, whatever we want to. We'll touch on all of the, type, which I've done already. We've got a paintbrush, a clone stamp. Actually, it didn't. Some of these are a little bit newish, or at least their placement is. Anyway, so that's the high level on our menus. If you notice too, whenever I select on different items, my options on this side kind of tend to change. If I got type selected, here are all my type options. They work pretty much the same way type in any other app does, but we'll look a little bit more at some of that stuff later. So, all right. So I'm going to delete that. And we're actually going to animate something. And actually, we'll do this as just a little quick little exercise, but should be familiar with this anyway from Premiere, but we've got these little stopwatches, and if we, actually, let me bring my type back. So if my type's up here, and I click the stopwatch, wherever my playhead is, we'll slide it to the beginning. If I set the stopwatch for position, it's going to set a keyframe there. I slide my timeline across, move. Oops. I had the wrong layer open. My type layer. Let's just set position. Come across the 15. Grab my type. Pull it down to here. It'll set another keyframe. And that's all I need to do to animate an element on screen. So it's just keyframes like we had in Premiere. All right, so I'm going to delete my type layer. So let's do this. Let's create a composition and just put a, so delete that. So create a new composition. This is 1920 by 1080. It's 10 seconds long. And let's start by coming down here into our timeline, just sort of either, actually let's go to the layer menu. Let's get used to doing it this way. Go to the layer menu, new, and let's do a new solid. So basically a solid is just going to create a solid color panel that's the size of my composition. And by default, that's what it's actually going to set here. So I'm going to leave it to the composition size. If you want to change the color of it, come down here to the color box, and we can, I'm just going to make it a light color of some kind, like a light yellow. Say okay. And when you're done, say okay. And you'll get this pale yellow solid down here on your timeline with a color that basically covers your background. So it's also worth pointing out that whenever you create a solid, in your project window, it actually creates a folder for you for your solids. If you remember earlier, I had a pale blue one. But here's the yellow one that I just created. What's nice about this is if I end up with multiple compositions in a project, which I will, and I want to make sure I've got the same color from one to the other, color background in them, let's do this. So we put a color background here. So let's make another composition. Let's come over here to our project window and go to the very bottom to this Create New Composition button down here. Click on it. It's going to have the settings of the last composition I created, which is good. That's what I want. I'm going to go ahead and give it a name now. This will be my maybe this will be my intro composition. Give it a name so you can tell what it is. And I'll say okay. So now if we go down here on our timeline, once we've created that, you'll see that there's two tabs. Here's my main composition, and right next to it is the new composition that I created. So even though I've got a project that only works for one project, I can have multiple compositions, and I can have multiple composition windows available to work on at any given time. So in this new composition window, if I come up here to my solids, grab my pale yellow solid and drag it straight down here into my down here into my timeline and let go of it, there's that solid. So it matches the color that I've got over here. One of those things that nobody really ever told me originally and explained to me, but I mean, once I figured it out, it's like, oh, that makes a heck of a lot of sense. So I always try to make sure I point it out. You can reuse solids because it actually saves them as an object for you. If I want to change the color of this solid, if I double click on it, so here's my composition window, but I double clicked on the solid, so it gives me that solid in a new window. I could make edits to that if I wanted to. I think if I go, oh, maybe I can't do it here, come to think of it. I can't. I got to go back into the regular composition to do it. I can change the color of the solid if I want to, but usually rather than changing the color of a solid, I'll just create a new solid. That way I can apply it to anything I need to apply it to. But anyway, so we've reused that solid. So I want to create, so we've got our solid here, and I'm back on my main composition. I'm going to actually close this other composition window. So we're back here on this composition. Let's go up here and grab our pen tool and just kind of click on, make sure your solid's not selected. Make sure there's, just click down here in your workspace, make sure nothing's selected. And let's just draw a black line from left to right. Basically, clicking with the pen tool, hold down my shift key and click on the other side. If I come up here to, and this is just, there's two places I can make changes to this line. I can either come over here to my shape properties on the sidebar, or from within my default layout, it's also up here on the top bar. And you'll see that this is the fill color for it. Here's the stroke color. If I click on that, it'll allow me to change the color. And then right next to it's a little blue 0. If I click on that and drag across, I can give some thickness to that line. You can also just click on that number and type the thickness you want. And I think the gold color needs to be darker. So now, basically I put a floor in my composition. And there's my solid, there's the shape layer is my line. So, and I'm going to select that, tap return on my keyboard because I just want to give it a name. This is going to be floor, is what I'll call it. Because what I'm going to create is, now that I've done that, make sure nothing's selected. Come up here to our primitives, the rectangle tool in our top bar. Click on that. Grab your ellipse tool, and we're just going to draw a circle, which has picked up my solid color and my color. I can change all this stuff, but I did this on purpose the way I did it. I drew it off center in the upper corner. It's not necessarily where I want it, but I did it to make a point, not really make a point, but to demonstrate something. So I drew this circle, and if you notice, with this circle selected, the center point's all the way over here in the middle of my composition. And by default, when I draw a shape, regardless of where I draw it on my artboard, After Effects places the anchor point right in the middle of our composition, which, quite honestly, does us no real good. I don't really know why it's that way exactly. One of those unexplained mysteries. But if I select that shape layer, because if I want to rotate that, see, it's going to rotate out there. That's not what I want, right? So what I need to do is actually I need to make sure that I move that center point. I can do this one of two ways. If I click on it and drag it, I can do that for sure. But the other way I think is easier and it's much more precise, which is kind of what I want. If I right click on my shape, go down to transform, there is a center anchor point to my layer, to your layer content. Select that, which is actually also what is that? Option Command up arrow. But if you center anchor point to the layer content, it'll zip that anchor point right over there. And if what I really wanted was for that to be in the center of my workspace, that shape, now all I really have to do is select this, go over here to, if it's not in my sidebar, I can go to my window menu and grab my align tools, bring those in, and I can center to the composition that shape. This is another little maneuver that you're going to get pretty comfortable with, I think. Because you always want to control where that center point is because of the different types of animation things we do. So it's definitely knowing that trick is worthwhile. So I'm actually going to, and actually I don't even really want it on the center. But ultimately I don't anyway. So I'm going to actually move this down to the bottom. And you can make this circle whatever you want. I mean, it can be whatever color, whatever. So I'm just going to leave it this way for now. But we're going to move it down here. And actually, no, we're not. We're going to move it up here. I'm going to move it up out of my workspace. All right. So it's up here off my artboard. And I'm going to come down here to my shape layer. I guess I should name this ball. Open my position tab. Set my at frame 0. I want to set the position up there. And then come across to a second, I guess, something like that. And let's pull it down to the line. And then come back out here to 2 seconds. And I've got my choice. I can either move this back up off of the screen, or if I come over here and select my first keyframe, I can copy it, Command C, and then wherever my playhead is, I can paste that keyframe. So now I get this movement. Do I need to do any of that again, or are we all still with me? Want me to do it again? Okay. So let me undo this a few times. All right. All right. So I've got this ball, and I moved it up here to the top, off the screen. And down, so I come down here to my timeline, and this shape layer, if I just tap P on my keyboard, because I'm going to change its position. So it's out of the screen now, it's going to come onto screen. So I'm just going to tap the P key on my keyboard for position. And while it's out here off the screen, I'm going to click, make sure that your playhead is at the very beginning. of your frame. So the playhead should be here. Set my first keyframe. You see it sets it right there. Then I'm going to take my playhead, move it across to 1 second. We're going to grab this ball, slide it down here to where we want it. And it sets that keyframe. And then I'm going to go out here to 2 seconds. And like I said, I can either grab this and move it back up if I want to, or if I want to make sure it goes back to the exact same spot, I'm just going to come over here and click this first keyframe, select it, Command C on my keyboard to copy it. And with my playhead at 2 seconds, I'm just going to Command V to paste. And it'll place that keyframe and all of its timings right there. So I did this over the course of 2 seconds. And I want to zoom in here so I can see a little bit better. I want it to be exactly 2 seconds. So I'm going to slip these to where I want them. And then, remember that this little trim area I talked about is basically the work area. I'm going to slide this, I want to slide my trim area bar over here to 2 seconds as well. Pull my playhead back to the beginning. Deselect everything. So if I hit the space bar on my keyboard or up here under preview, the play button, one of the two, it's going to play my composition over and over again. Now, I want to look at something here real fast. Interesting. So, and it's just looping. So we kind of created our first looping animation. It's not fantastic, but you know what? It loops, and that's all we really wanted it to do. So there are a couple of things I'll point, even with this simple little example, a couple of things I want to point out. Pay attention to whenever it gets to the top. It looks like it never really leaves the frame, doesn't it? Doesn't it look like a little piece of it still stays in the frame the whole time? That's one of those funky things. It's a 30 frame per second animation, so it's a lot of frames in a short space. It's one of those kind of visual things. I have one or two things I can do to fix that. I'll either pull my keyframe in a little bit so it's actually off screen a little bit longer and appears to stay off screen, which is actually probably just the better solution. That way it at least appears to stay off screen. One of the things about animating is, and as we do more you'll catch on, is that it's one thing, I did everything right by the numbers. I had the ball off screen at 0 seconds, and I had the ball off screen again at 2 seconds. But when I set my composition to 2 seconds in length and I play it, that's not the effect that I got, because the way frames kind of fill in and whatnot, the numbers are one thing, but you've got to always adjust for perception, no matter what you're doing. So that's the kind of thing that becomes really apparent when we talk about timing things to music. It's just like in Premiere whenever you're timing stuff to music. You can hit your marks just right, but when you go back and play it, sometimes things seem a little bit off, and you've got to make a judgment adjustment. And this is the same way. It's no different. But it's a very simple animation, and it's a looping animation. We're actually going to want to create looping animations in here, our first project with After Effects is going to be a looping animation. Basically, in a looping animation, our first frame and our last frame match, so that when it loops around and starts over again, it's seamless and it's, you don't really miss a beat. This is not a looping animation. Yeah, it starts over again, but the ball stops mid-frame and then it jumps and starts over. You really want it, a looping animation is a fluid, motion, and you never see those kinds of breaks. So that's not a looping animation, but what we had in the first place was. So, So just by way of a pretty simple little animation. So we've got multiple compositions, solids. We just kind of animated a little ball bouncing here. With After Effects, this is the kind of thing we're going to focus on more than incorporate. I mean, we'll incorporate some video, but we're going to focus more on graphic animation. So utilizing traditional animation techniques and that sort of thing. I've got a nice a video that I can't remember the guy's name now, but we're going to learn a little bit about traditional animation techniques that we can apply in After Effects as well. So that'll probably be on Monday, actually. We'll touch on that a little bit so that we can do a little bit more with what we've got here. But those are, sort of that's just a very simple, get it done kind of an animation. So just by way of some of the things that we can do with After Effects, and I've got stuff that I've used for my motion design class, but so we did a simple animation, kind of found our way around. If I go, let's look here. So I do have yeah, let's save this. So so when I said that our compositions can get pretty full, this is sort of what I'm talking about. These aren't even all that full, but we can do type animations that are really simple kinds of things. These involve, Cinema has a 3D camera or some 3D tools that do a nice job for 2.5D animation. Do little animations like that. Part of the reason I brought this one up is one of the things I didn't show you in the other file, but in our composition window, there's a scale drop down here. So I'm looking at this at 100% of size. And where it says full right next to that is the resolution. So it's looking at full screen resolution. as we get into, whenever we preview anything, you see this little green bar running right below the trim bar? That's our RAM preview cache. So After Effects actually renders every single frame in memory, in RAM. And this green bar set basically says that all of these frames are available in RAM right now, which basically is filling up our RAM, loading it up. And whenever I play it, it's playing smooth now. But if I go back here and grab a different comp of this, no, what is this? So you see how, whenever I scrub along here, you see how the green bar is broken? Basically, the only frames that are in the cache are the green ones, and it's going through and rebuilding. But whenever that green bar isn't solid, you're going to get choppy playback. Sometimes you do a composition that has a lot of stuff in it. You're utilizing blurs. You're utilizing, motion blur is a RAM-intensive kind of a thing. Layer styles are a RAM-intensive kind of thing. All sorts of things that we can do here that eat up a lot of RAM. Eventually, you'll kind of get to a point that the playback just won't play smooth no matter what you try and do. It just is always choppy. You make a little adjustment, a whole chunk comes out of that green line, and it takes forever to rebuild it. The things you can do to combat that are, actually the reason this is rendering decent is my resolution set to half. If you leave everything set to full and try to play that, eventually, this is doing okay. But that RAM preview is having a hard time keeping up. If I I'm looking at the resolution at full size. If I change the scale down to like half size, and I drop the resolution that I'm looking at to say a third, I can't see a difference in what I'm looking at. But look how much faster my RAM preview filled up in order to keep the preview nice and smooth. So when things get slow, when they get choppy, remember you can reduce the size that you're viewing it, and you can reduce the resolution of it. This is only a preview setting. It has absolutely nothing to do with when you render it. If I go and render this right now, it's going to render at full size and full resolution. This is only has to do with the preview to help us be able to work a little faster and a little quicker. So if you're doing something, just remember that it's getting slow and it doesn't, or you're working on I'm not 100% sure if these machines are highly enough powered to have enough RAM in them to let you work smoothly and efficiently or not. But my laptop has 16 gigs and it's still, it does a good job, but it still bogs down pretty fast. So you can make those adjustments, but if worse comes to worse, you can always come up here to the edit menu, down to purge, and you can purge all the caches and it'll clear them all out. And then it'll have to rebuild them, but it'll have more room to do more work. So that's another way to kind of fight it if it's slowing down on you, is to clear all your caches. That was something I didn't necessarily plan on getting into, but we can do that kind of thing. I think I've got where are my samples? I know it's somewhere. Here. Here's another, this is actually I did this about a year ago. But, so, you can bring anything into After Effects you want. And, like I said, photos, Illustrator files, and whatnot. when I do explainer videos, I usually do two-dimensional, I do 2D animation or illustration, and I animate that. This will open up in a minute, as soon as it finishes here. But it's just kind of another example of how full things can get, or how much stuff you can get in a composition. Ugh. It's being slow. And I'm almost done here, I promise. Because probably what we'll do on Monday is we're going to take a look at basic animation techniques, but talk about different forms of animation and how they apply to After Effects. So, oh, come on. Probably because I'm opening this from my external drive. Or maybe it just doesn't want to open. But After Effects just lets us do some pretty complex kinds of animations. And we're not going to do things that are real complex, but we're going to kind of pick stuff apart and animate it. I mean, the first project for After Effects is actually to do an animated poster. And we're going to, find a poster for a movie we like and animate that. It involves some Photoshop work, cutting stuff up, manipulating it, some things like that. All the stuff, all of which we're kind of going to go through, probably start looking at next week. But that's kind of crazy. The video that I'm getting ready to open there is actually well, it's not this one, but I've got this one on here as well. But basically all the type, the supers, the graphics, the front end and the back end are all animated in After Effects. I think that'll work. The video that won't open is this one. But again, all Illustrator illustrations taken into After Effects and animated. This one's actually a little slow, but what we are going to kind of work on is easing and movements. I mean, movement is what makes everything work in After Effects. It's good, clean, solid movements. When stuff just slides in and stops, it usually needs a little bit of help, so. So, apparently that file is just not going to open. So we'll work on, the techniques in it, whatnot anyway to kind of do stuff like that. I'll try to do that one more time. That's irritating. AEP, that is right. Let's just continue, see what we get. There we go. So anyway, this is all my audio assets, Illustrator assets, solids. But there's one of the things we'll look at is doing scenes, pre-composing those, and then using those scenes within a composition. So we can embed compositions inside of compositions. But they get, a bunch of different parts. Here's, what's that, text. So here's the comp for that first full scene. But even within that comp, we've got stacks of paper that are sort of built out and placed over and over again. Compositions and compositions and compositions. But they're all Illustrator files when they start, and we'll look at the best way to kind of set those kinds of things up. So, by the time we're done, something like that shouldn't be too far off. So, we'll just kind of work our way through it and try some different things. But we'll do a little bit of character animation, basic character animation. Like I said, we're going to animate a movie poster, a couple little projects. We'll probably do the traditional bouncing ball kind of a thing. But that's kind of what's in store for what we do here. So.